Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody, to Hands-On Apologetics, and we have a special edition. I'm going to dive into some material that I have in my brand new book, which is called Revolt Against Reality, Fighting the Foes of Sanity and Truth from the Serpent to the State. It's available through Catholic Answers Press. Just go to shop.catholic.com and type in Revolt Against Reality, and you can get a copy. And so what I wanted to do today is focus on some things that perhaps I haven't done in other interviews, but nevertheless I think is very important. So let me explain a little bit about what I do in the book. Basically, what I do is I try to give the deep causes of the current insanity in which we live in today. And by doing that, I traced backwards from today into history, the immediate causes, and then follow those causes back and back all the way to the incarnation, and then actually take it even back to the garden. So it's almost like, even though it's not that thick of a book, it's a kind of a overview of the causes from the serpent in the garden all the way till today, about how we ended up in the craziness. But anyway, it's interesting because in the book, God willing, I showed the centrality of the incarnation. I can't underestimate or understate, I can't overstate, I should say, the importance of the incarnation. When God becomes man, when he assumes to himself human nature, there is a radical revolution that occurs in human history. And in a very real way, the incarnation becomes that turning point in human history. Because why? Because all of a sudden there is this great unifying movement where the invisible God becomes visible. The immaterial takes to himself materiality. The eternal God enters time. The omnipresent God enters space. And this radical union of God with his creation in the incarnation also enables us to have this radical union with God through grace in Christ Jesus, and being parts of his body, members of the church, we're radically united to each other. So if you can think of the incarnation as this point in history that's this great unifying movement, it's almost like, critical mass in an A-bomb. Not only is there critical mass, everything's united, but from that union spurs all these incredible revolutions of thought in society, in the ways we view ourselves, in the way that things ought to be ordered. That flash of insight, those revolutions of thought, usher in a very realistic understanding of the world and our relationship to the world and God's relationship to the world. And that brings about things like, eventually modern science and all sorts of other social revolutions. And it's very interesting because immediately after the incarnation, Christianity just erupts on the scene in the ancient world and begins to usher in these things that otherwise would never occur, I think, in the human imagination. And so pagan society quickly finds itself on life support. Why? Because people are abandoning the temples. People are becoming Christian left and right. And all of this in spite of the fact that Christian revelation is very contrary to pagan thought. I mean, the bodily resurrection, for example, that was probably one of the most absurd things you could propose to a pagan, much less the incarnation. Why? Because material things, our bodies, are the seats of pain, of suffering. And the body's not good. It's not good, folks. What's really good is the spiritual soul, according to pagan worldview. And so actually death is preferable because, hey, your spiritual soul gets freed from the bondages of this terrible body of ours. Put that in perspective with God actually becoming one of us, flesh and bone. Why would God want to do that? According to the pagans, that's just pure absurdity. And again, the bodily resurrection too. Talk about square peg round hole for pagan thought, because it's good for the immaterial soul to be freed of the burdens of the body. Why would we want to be entrapped back in a glorified body? So, despite all this, the pagan worldview, Christianity starts to take over in a very strong way. Its growth is exponential, and various sociologists have tried to trace the trajectory of that growth, but it really is meteoric. And in fact, by the time you get to the 200s, the time of Tertullian, like Tertullian, just a martyr even in 150 AD, begins to mock the pagans that look at all your temples are being abandoned. And Christianity is everywhere in the city, in the country. It's held by those in high esteem, high members of government. It's held by the lowest members of society. It's everywhere, and we're taking over. And that sets the stage ultimately for Constantine, who, as you know, himself undergoes a kind of conversion, and he legalizes Christianity and actually ushers in religious freedom within the empire, which it wasn't necessarily there before. Constantine, I could go on and on about Constantine, but nevertheless, he kind of ushers in an era where now at the highest ranks of the Roman Empire, Christianity is not only just not persecuted or suppressed, but it is favored in many different ways. In fact, Constantine gives all sorts of gifts and gives favors for the Christian church in various ways, all of which is very good, very important. And it continues on. Now, I'm not going to give you a whole history, but eventually we run into a snag, right? Because at one point in time, there arises an emperor who is not favorable to Christianity. In fact, he's very much anti-Christian, and he wants to restore paganism. And that is the fellow known as Julian the Apostate, who became emperor in 361 to 363. And if you ever get a chance to look into the bio of Julian the Apostate, I highly recommend it. It's very much a tragic life. He was born into a Christian family, and of course, he's part of that family that comes from Constantine. So, he is in line for being an emperor, although he is quite young. And through all these political machinations, almost his entire family is murdered by political rivals. And so he ends up having a really tough and hard life, with basically his neck on the line, because he could be a claimant to the throne. And as things work out, it turns out he actually does become emperor. And it's during this period where, because people failed to live up to their Christian faith and instead continued the ways of the Roman Empire, with backstabbing and so on, that Julian turns from his Christian faith and becomes a bona fide pagan. In fact, a pagan evangelist, so to speak. And people have tried to point out when this happened. It's very possible that he was educated by pagan philosophers who were kind of on the sly, feeding him lots of anti-Christian ideas and bolstering his belief in paganism. But anyway, once he becomes emperor, he decides that Christianity is not good for the empire. And what he needs to do is restore paganism, take it off life support, and turn it back to the former glory that it once had in the Roman Empire. And so that's what I want to focus on today. We're going to look at some of the things that he did, and also another fellow named Porphyry, if we have enough time, and look at how did he design to bring back paganism in A world that, well, pagans were still the majority, although it was very much, like I said, on life support. And the end was near, so to speak. So what was his campaign to do that? And what's really interesting is, as we look at these measures that he takes, you're going to see how this later on in church history repeats itself under various guises, but it's still the same kind of methodology. The same ideas just worked out slightly differently. So if you ever wonder how in the world did we get to where we are today, well, one of those things is the stuff that Julian had trailblazed back in his day in the 300s. Okay, so we're coming up to a break. I want to talk, I'll give you the 4 things he does, and then we'll come back and we'll dive into those. The first is he revokes all the gifts of lands, rights, immunities Constantine gave to the church and demands its repayment. The second thing he does is he changes education. He forbids Christians from being teachers of rhetoric and grammar. We'll talk about what that is and its implications as well. Third thing he does is, and this is a very important one, is he reforms the pagan priesthood to become more Christian in a way. And we're going to talk about what that means and what it entailed for him to do that. And then finally, and we probably won't dive into it, although it's a fascinating event in history, Julian embarks on rebuilding the Jerusalem temple. Yeah, that is huge because remember, Jesus says, tear down this temple in 3 days, I will rebuild it. And he's talking about his body. And then one generation after the crucifixion in 70 A.D., the Jerusalem temple is destroyed and all sacrifices cease. And of course, this is something Jesus had predicted, that there won't be a stone upon another stone until all is accomplished. Well, that happened in 70 A.D., and it was one of the most strongest apologies for the truth of Christianity. Well, Julian decides that he is going to rebuild the temple, reestablish, the working Old Testament or Old Covenant. And of course, if the Old Covenant can be reinstituted, then Christianity becomes marginalized, and we lose that huge, huge apologetic for the truth of Christianity from the events of history. So we'll learn a little bit about that. But like I said, I'm not going to go into too much detail.